I've been sitting on this for a long time, mostly because I don't know what I'm hoping to get out of telling it. Forgiveness, maybe? Or absolution. Or maybe I just want to hear myself say it out loud in a place where no one knows my real name. My name is William. I'm not a mastermind. I'm not some criminal genius who planned everything 10 moves ahead. For most of my life, I was a guy who showed up to work, did what he was told, and tried to keep his head down. That's how I justified it, anyway. The crime I'm talking about happened about 8 years ago. It involved a high-profile homicide investigation that dominated local news for months. If you lived in my city at the time, you probably remember it. A young woman, missing for weeks, eventually found dead in a wooded area near an industrial park. The kind of case that brings in state police, special task forces, media vans, and true crime podcasters before the body is even cold. I wasn't a cop. I wasn't a detective. I worked in a forensic evidence processing unit as a contracted technician. I cataloged, logged, transported, and stored evidence. I labeled bags, scanned barcodes, filled out chain of custody forms. Boring, administrative stuff that no one thinks about until it goes wrong. I had just gone through a nasty divorce. I was buried in debt, behind on child support, and one missed paycheck away from losing my apartment. That's not an excuse, but it's part of the picture. I felt desperate. Cornered. Like the walls were slowly leaning inward. When someone first approached me about adjusting a piece of evidence, they didn't frame it as sabotage. They didn't say obstruction of justice. They didn't say tamper. They said, "We just need to make sure the right person goes down." They said, "It's already basically solved." They said, "You're not planting anything. You're just moving something out of the way." And the phrase that stuck with me, the one I repeated to myself over and over. "It's just a job." At the time, I believed it. Or I pretended to. This is the story of how I convinced myself I wasn't a criminal, while committing one of the worst crimes I've ever been part of. The second conversation didn't happen in some dark alley or smoky back room. It happened in the parking garage under my building, next to my rusted Corolla, with fluorescent lights flickering like they were about to die. It was a guy named Marcus. Not his real name, obviously. I'd seen him around the evidence facility before, but not in my department. He wore the same bland khakis and button-downs everyone else did. Nothing about him screamed villain. That made it easier. He didn't lead with money. That would have made it too obvious. Instead, he talked about the case. About how the prime suspect had a history of violence. About how the victim deserved justice. About how technicalities ruin good cases. Then he slid into specifics. There was a fiber sample recovered from the victim's clothing. One that didn't match the suspect. It hadn't been fully analyzed yet, just logged and stored. Marcus wanted that fiber to disappear. Not destroyed. Not replaced. Misfiled, he said. Lost in the noise. He told me exactly which evidence bag it was in. Exactly where it was shelved. That's when I realized this wasn't a random idea. Someone had studied our system. I asked why me? He said, "You're careful. You don't draw attention. You need money." He wasn't wrong. I went upstairs that night and stared at my ceiling for hours. Every time I told myself, "No," another bill notification buzzed on my phone. By morning, I had started planning. Once I crossed that invisible line from thinking about it to planning it, everything started feeling disturbingly practical. I knew our evidence workflow inside and out. Items came in, got logged, scanned, sealed, shelved, and periodically audited. Most people assume there's constant oversight. There isn't. It's a lot of trust layered on top of paperwork. My first step was timing. I checked the audit schedule. The fiber samples shelf wasn't due for inventory for another 3 weeks. That gave me a window. Second step, camouflage. I couldn't just grab the bag and walk off with it. That would leave a hole. A missing barcode. A red flag. So I printed a duplicate barcode label using an older printer we still had in the back room, one that didn't automatically log print jobs to the system. I planned to stick that duplicate onto an empty evidence bag and slide it into the same slot. Same shelf. Same position. Wrong contents. Third step, access. I volunteered for an extra shift on a Sunday night. Skeleton crew. Minimal supervision. The kind of shift where everyone just wants to clock out and go home. I told myself I was being cautious. Really, I was rehearsing how to become a thief. Sunday nights at the facility have a strange, hollow feel. The building hums, but it's mostly empty, like it's holding its breath. I clocked in at 6:02 p.m. I remember because I stared at the timestamp longer than usual, like I was trying to burn it into my brain. First thing I noticed, my hands wouldn't stop sweating. Not shaking yet. Just damp, clammy, wrong. I forced myself into routine. Logged into the terminal. Checked a few incoming items. Made small talk with Jenna from intake about how slow it was. I laughed at a joke she made. That part scares me the most in hindsight, how normal I could act. At 7-Eleven, I rolled an empty evidence cart towards storage room C. No one questioned it. People moved carts around constantly. The shelf with the fiber samples sat halfway down the third row. Exactly where Marcus said it would be. I stood there for a full minute pretending to read labels while my heart hammered in my ears. This was the moment where I could still walk away. Instead, I pulled the bag. I expected it to feel heavier. Not physically, it weighed almost nothing, but morally, spiritually, whatever word fits. Instead, it felt exactly like every other evidence bag I'd handled 1,000 times before. Clear plastic. Heat-sealed edge. White barcode label. Handwritten initials and sharp. That normality messed with my head. I slid the bag onto the cart, keeping my body between it and the aisle like that would somehow make it invisible. Every footstep echoes sounded too loud. Every distant door closing made my shoulders tense. I wheeled into the small processing alcove near the back, the one with the old printer and the rarely used heat sealer. My fingers fumbled pulling out the empty bag I'd stashed earlier inside a box of gloves. I peeled the duplicate barcode sticker off its backing. It stuck slightly crooked. That tiny imperfection almost made me abort everything. I stared at it, thinking, this is how they'll know. This stupid angle. I forced myself to straighten it as best I could. Then I faced the real moment. I opened the genuine evidence bag. Inside was a small paper bindle containing the fiber. It looked insignificant. Like dust. Like it couldn't possibly decide anyone's fate. I swapped the contents. Real fiber into my pocket. Empty bindle into the bag. I sealed it. Once the seal melted closed, there was no undoing it. I had officially crossed the line. Putting the bag back on the shelf felt harder than taking it. My legs had that weak, buzzy feeling you get after standing up too fast. I kept expecting someone to round the corner, to clear their throat, to ask what I was doing. No one did. I slid the bag into the exact slot it had come from. Same orientation. Label facing outward. I even nudged the neighboring bag so it didn't look disturbed. Then I stood there, staring at the shelf, half expecting alarms to start blaring. Nothing happened. The world didn't crack open. No lightning bolt. No voice of God telling me I doomed myself. I pushed the cart back to its usual spot and forced myself to do another mundane task, logging a blood sample from an unrelated case, just to prove to myself I could still function. All the while, I could feel the fiber in my pocket. It might as well have been radioactive. I kept imagining it burning through the fabric of my pants, leaving a visible hole, exposing me to everyone. At 8:40, Marcus texted me a single word. Done? I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed. Yeah. Immediately, I felt sick. I hadn't just followed instructions. I had chosen to participate. That distinction would haunt me later. For the rest of the shift, I avoided mirrors. I was afraid of what I'd see looking back. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, terrified of being pulled over for some minor traffic violation. A broken taillight. Rolling through a stop sign. Anything that could put me face to face with a cop while illegal evidence sat in my pocket. Every red light felt like a spotlight. I kept imagining scenarios where an officer casually asked, "Mind if I search your vehicle?" and I'd collapse on the spot. The original plan had been simple. Marcus would take the fiber off my hands the next day. But I suddenly hated the idea of keeping it anywhere near my apartment. So I did something impulsive. I stopped at a 24-hour laundromat. I went into the bathroom, locked the stall, and stared at the tiny paper bindle in my palm. It looked even smaller under fluorescent bathroom lighting. I flushed it. I stood there watching the water swirl, half expecting it to float back up, to refuse to disappear, to expose me. It vanished. Instant relief. Followed immediately by a deeper dread. Because now the evidence wasn't just misplaced. It was destroyed. I had escalated the crime without telling anyone. When I got back to my car, I realized my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition on the first try. I kept telling myself, "It's done. It's over. I was wrong. It was just beginning." I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, terrified of being pulled over for some minor traffic violation. A broken taillight. Rolling through a stop sign. Anything that could put me face to face with a cop while illegal evidence sat in my pocket. Every red light felt like a spotlight. I kept imagining scenarios where an officer casually asked, "Mind if I search your vehicle?" and I'd collapse on the spot. The original plan had been simple. Marcus would take the fiber off my hands the next day. But I suddenly hated the idea of keeping it anywhere near my apartment. So I did something impulsive. I stopped at a 24-hour laundromat. I went into the bathroom, locked the stall, and stared at the tiny paper bindle in my palm. It looked even smaller under fluorescent bathroom lighting. I flushed it. I stood there watching the water swirl, half expecting it to float back up, to refuse to disappear, to expose me. It vanished. Instant relief. Followed immediately by a deeper dread. Because now the evidence wasn't just misplaced. It was destroyed. I had escalated the crime without telling anyone. When I got back to my car, I realized my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition on the first try. I kept telling myself, "It's done. It's over." I was wrong. It was just beginning. 2 days later, the case made the news again. They had officially charged the suspect. The headline used words like "overwhelming evidence" and "strong forensic support." I stared at the TV in the break room while a couple of coworkers nodded approvingly. "Good," someone said. "That guy's a monster." My stomach twisted. If things were supposed to feel better after doing the job, no one told my nervous system. The first real problem surfaced during a routine internal inquiry. Not an audit, something smaller. A junior analyst had been cross-checking lab submission lists against physical inventory because a different case had shown a minor discrepancy. She sent an email. "Has anyone physically handled bag #C7712 recently? Contents description doesn't match older notes." That number punched me in the chest. I stared at the screen, rereading it over and over. The duplicate bag I planted still had a label describing fiber sample, but inside was an empty bindle. At some point, someone must have noticed the weight difference. Or the feel. Or maybe the bindle had shifted and looked too flat. I didn't reply. I told myself staying silent was safer than saying the wrong thing. But silence has weight too. That afternoon, my supervisor casually asked if I'd worked storage room C recently. I said, "Not that I remember." It came out too fast. He nodded. But his eyes lingered a second longer than normal. That second stretched into a lifetime in my head. The story I'd built was starting to wobble. And I knew that once a lie starts to wobble, it usually falls. After that conversation, everything became a potential threat. 2 people whispering in the hallway? About me. Someone laughing behind me? Definitely about me. An email marked urgent that had nothing to do with evidence? Still made my heart spike. I started sleeping in 2-hour chunks. I'd jolt awake convinced someone was knocking at my door, or that I'd missed a call from an unknown number that meant my life was over. At work, I became aggressively normal. Too normal. I smiled more. I offered to help people. I stayed late. I volunteered for extra shifts I didn't need. I thought I was blending in. In reality, I was probably standing out. Marcus texted me asking how things looked on my end. I told him. Fine. I didn't tell him I'd destroyed the fiber. I didn't tell him about the email. I didn't tell him about my supervisor's question. Part of me was angry at him. He'd framed this as a simple misfile, a harmless nudge. But now I was sitting on a felony-level secret while he walked around unbothered. Another part of me knew I didn't get to shift blame. No one forced me. I kept replaying the moment I flushed the fiber. That was the real turning point. Not when Marcus asked. Not when I printed the label. When I decided on my own to make the evidence cease to exist. That choice felt heavier than everything else combined. I started wondering if guilt has a physical shape. If it does, it lives in your chest and slowly presses inward. And it never lets go. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Not from the police. Not from internal affairs. From my supervisor. Hey, William, can you step into my office for a minute? Casual tone. Friendly voice. I felt my pulse in my throat as I followed him down the hallway. Every step felt like I was walking toward a trapdoor. Inside his office sat another man I didn't recognize. Plain clothes. No badge visible. Mid-40s. Calm eyes. This is Eric, my supervisor said. He's assisting with a records consistency review. Records consistency review. Not investigation. Not interrogation. But close enough to make my mouth go dry. Eric asked simple questions. How long I'd been with the unit. Which storage rooms I usually worked in. Whether I remembered handling bags C-7712. I stuck to my lie. No, not specifically. I handle hundreds of bags a week. He nodded, jotting something down. Then he asked, Do you recall noticing anything unusual about the bag when you might have passed it? I shook my head. Nothing comes to mind. Silence filled the room. Eric looked at me for a long moment. Not accusing. Not friendly. Neutral. Somehow worse. Finally, he closed his notebook. All right. That's all for now. For now. Those 2 words echoed in my skull the rest of the day. I wasn't exposed. But I wasn't safe either. I had become a person waiting for consequences. And waiting, I was learning, is its own kind of punishment. Life kept going in the most insulting way possible. The trial started. Jury selection. Opening statements. Daily news updates. I followed everything obsessively, even though every article made me feel worse. The prosecution talked about motive, opportunity, past violent behavior. They talked about DNA. They talked about cell phone pings and surveillance footage. They never mentioned the fiber. Because as far as the official record was concerned, it existed. It was logged. It was shelved. It was just never emphasized. Which meant something important and horrifying. The case didn't actually need the piece of evidence I destroyed. That realization hit me like a punch. I hadn't ensured justice. I hadn't been a crucial cog. I had risked everything for something that ultimately didn't even matter. That somehow made it worse. If the fiber had been decisive, I could have clung to the lie that I'd helped convict a guilty man. But now I had no idea. The defendant could be guilty. He could be innocent. Either way, I had permanently altered the integrity of the process. I started thinking about the victim's family. About how they believed in the system. About how they'd probably be in the courtroom, crying, trusting that the evidence presented was clean. I was part of the dirt under the rug. No one had arrested me. No one had confronted me again. But I stopped feeling like a free person. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. The verdict came back guilty. Second-degree murder. When I saw the headline on my phone, I had to sit down on the edge of my bed because my legs gave out. Guilty should feel like relief. It didn't. All I could think was, I will never know if that's true. People at work were visibly happy. Someone brought donuts. My supervisor said, "Good work, everyone. Solid team effort on this case." I nodded along like I'd earned even one molecule of that praise. Inside, something curdled. Marcus texted me a few hours later. "Looks like it all worked out." That message made my stomach flip. I wanted to reply, "You don't know what I actually did." I wanted to say, "It didn't need us." I wanted to say, "We're not heroes." Instead, I typed, "Yeah." One word. The same word I'd used the night I committed the crime. It felt like sealing myself into a version of reality where I would always be the guy who says, "Yeah," instead of telling the truth. After the verdict, the internal records consistency review quietly ended. No follow-ups. No disciplinary actions. No consequences. On paper, I had gotten away with it. In my head, nothing felt finished. It felt permanent. Like a scar you don't see in the mirror but feel every time you move. I thought getting away with it would bring closure. Instead, it changed the way I looked at myself in small, corrosive ways. I used to think of myself as a basically decent person who'd made a bad choice. After the verdict, I stopped believing that. Because decent people don't live comfortably inside lies. They don't carry secrets that heavy and keep functioning. I started noticing how easily I lied in other parts of my life. Little stuff. Telling my kid I was stuck at work when I just didn't feel like driving over. Telling friends I was fine when I wasn't. Lying had become muscle memory. And that scared me more than the original crime. At work, I couldn't touch evidence without feeling a phantom sensation in my pocket, like that fiber was still there. Sometimes I'd open a bag and have a flash of nausea so strong I had to step away. No one else noticed. To them, I was the same William. To me, I was a man who knew exactly how fragile the justice system could be. Not because of budget cuts. Not because of bureaucracy. Because of people like me. Ordinary. Broke. Scared. Willing to bend when pressured. I realized something uncomfortable. The system isn't only vulnerable to monsters. It's vulnerable to normal guys, trying to survive. That might be the most terrifying part. I hadn't become a supervillain. I had become a cautionary example. And I didn't know how to undo that. So why talk about it? Why dredge this up years later, on an anonymous account, to strangers? Because I'm tired. Not the sleepy kind of tired. The kind that settles into your bones. I don't expect sympathy. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve either. What I do know is that carrying this alone has slowly hollowed me out. Every time I see a news story about a wrongful conviction, my chest tightens. Every time someone talks about trusting the evidence, I feel like I'm going to be sick. I've thought about confessing for real. Walking into an office. Asking for a lawyer. Blowing my own life up. Then I think about my kid. About losing any chance to be present in their life. About becoming a headline myself. And I chicken out. So this is the compromise my cowardice landed on. An anonymous confession. A digital message in a sea of millions. Maybe this is just me trying to convince myself I'm not completely irredeemable. Maybe it's me testing what it feels like to say it without immediate consequences. I don't know. What I do know is this. If you're reading this and you work anywhere near the justice system, understand how much power you actually hold. Even in the boring roles. especially in the boring roles. Power doesn't always look like a badge. Sometimes it looks like a barcode scanner, and someone willing to misuse it. I used to believe people who commit serious crimes wake up one day and decide to be evil. That's comforting. It creates distance. It lets you believe you're different. You're not. Most of the time, it's smaller than that. It's a bad week. A desperate month. A moment where someone offers you a shortcut that looks harmless enough if you squint. And the scariest part? Once you take that first step, your brain starts rewriting the story for you. You stop saying, I did something wrong. You start saying, I didn't have a choice. You stop saying, I hurt people. You start saying, I was just doing my job. If anyone reading this is ever asked to just adjust something, to look the other way, to help the right outcome happen, don't. I don't care how noble it sounds. I don't care how desperate you are. Walk away. Lose the job. Upset the person. Protect your ability to look at yourself without flinching. Because getting away with it is not freedom. It's a life sentence in a quieter prison. I don't know if I'll ever confess for real. I don't know if I deserve redemption. But I know this. The version of me who thought this was just a job is dead. And I'm the one who killed him.